Thank you for coming to the very last session of this year's AMS. My name is Daniel Borolski, and I will be chairing this session entitled Novel Approaches to Music for General Students, Adopting and Teaching from New Music Textbooks. The way we're going to work this today, since I'm not sure it's apparent from the program, is we have 4 speakers, all of whom will speak around 10 to 12 minutes. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through all 4 speakers at once without there being any questions or answers in the middle, and then we're going to open it up to a broader conversation for the remainder of the time. The order of the program is as follows, and I'm going to go ahead and read everybody's introductions now, because that way we can sort of go from one to the next, and we fortunately have very little technological dependencies, so we should have, I hope, fewer hiccups.
But not yet.
But not yet. Well, I'm going to read while Mary's getting things ready. So we have our first paper is by Jennifer L. Hund, who is co-author of several study and listening guides for W.W. Norton, and recently developed an online interactive listening pedagogy and digital content for the enjoyment of music. She's presented her research at conferences regionally, nationally, and internationally on topics ranging from the pedagogy of music history and music appreciation to cultural dialogue in the post-Italian magical repertoire. Jennifer's not here. Apparently she's on a bicycle trip somewhere in South America, is what I'm told. So Mary Nafik will be speaking as Jennifer and doing her best impersonation. So she will be our first speaker. Our second speaker is Chris Freitag, who's been publishing books in music for more than 20 years, most recently and happily as the music editor at Norton. When not reading, writing, and thinking about music appreciation and other courses, he performs as a classical guitarist. He received his musical education at the University of South Dakota, Temple University, and Cornell University. Our third speaker, Robin Wallace, is the author of Take Note, An Introduction to Music Through Active Listening, a new music appreciation textbook published last year by Oxford University Press. He is a professor of musicology at Baylor University and is currently on leave and working on a book on Beethoven's deafness. Our final speaker is Reeves Schulstadt, is an associate professor in the Hayes School of Music at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. Along with music history, Schulstadt teaches music appreciation, music and gender, and the introduction to world music for the general education program at ASU. She has just recently returned from a sabbatical, allowing her to work on the life and music of Twee St. George Tucker. So, all right. So with that, Mary Nafik as Jennifer.
Is this on? Yeah. I offered to switch places with Jennifer, but she go to South America, but she didn't take me up on it. Okay, so conversations about novel approaches to teaching general students often revolves around the fact that the vast majority of music appreciation texts published since the 1950s have a similar organization and repertoire. Books begin with an introduction to musical sound known as Elements of Music and conclude with a chronological survey of the development of musical style in the Western European art tradition. As a point of entry into this discussion, I'll provide a general historical overview of changes in music appreciation textbooks over the past 100 years, and I do so with bias. I use a topical organization for my own classroom, not chronological, and my motivation for digging into our history was to understand the larger cultural and ethical implications of this homogenization of textbooks. To begin, I borrow an argument from Dr. Julia Chabalski, who in her 2008 dissertation explored music appreciation as a cultural movement during the first half of the 20th century. She notes that advocates of music appreciation, who distinguish between classical and popular, between highbrow and lowbrow, contributed to ongoing constructions of race, gender, and class differences, unquote, and participate in a national discourse on, quote, morality, intellectualism, and democratic patriotism, unquote. I consider how the discourse she identifies from the first half of the 20th century continues to influence pedagogy in music appreciation textbooks today, and how the homogenization of textbooks over the past 60 years brings to the surface tensions between cultural discourse then and cultural discourse now. In the first half of the 20th century, advocates of music appreciation participated in national conversations about a variety of intertwining topics relating to their field, to democracy and national life, especially during and after times of war, to the development of high moral standards and good taste, and to a complete liberal arts education. Beginning in the 1920s, the general public had at their disposal recordings, which offered more affordable and accessible musical experiences, as well as greater exposure to more genres. This prompted advocates of music appreciation, from classroom instructors and performers to philanthropists and political leaders, to actively engage in a nationwide educational effort to bring their love of classical music, as well as its cultural and social benefits, to the general population. One of the necessary steps toward educating the masses at that time was teaching how to discern good music from bad. Advocates believed that by learning this skill, one would develop a sense of good taste, which would transfer directly into the development of a strong moral society that is educated, has an appreciation for the finer things in life, and demonstrates civility at its core. The distinction between good taste and bad was directly linked to repertoire. Advocates of music appreciation emphasized repeatedly that classical music was high culture and therefore good, while popular music was, to quote Edward Dickinson from 1914, quote, vulgar, trashy, cheap, and nasty, unquote. Like many social progressives, Dickinson noted that if exposed to good music, the public will like it, and in turn, quote, the elevation of people's amusements would raise public contentment and public morals. Chabowski calls this elevation of Western classical music a sacralization, and from its heightened aesthetic position, classical music became a solution for what was wrong in American society and culture, and what was wrong was deeply connected to definitions of race, gender, and social class. Time and again, advocates of music appreciation considered classical music at its very core a tool for great social, cultural, and political change in the United States, believing in its power to combat against the sexually charged, racially identified popular music that exhibited low morals and non-existent social benefits. Textbooks that were published in the 1950s were products of this conversation and reflected the cultural discourse of the first half of the 20th century. While raising the intellectual standard of the field and incorporated music appreciation into a liberal arts education, advocates also, according to Chabowski, necessarily drew from and reinforced lines of social, racial, and gender stratification. Since the 1950s, however, textbooks revealed tensions between larger cultural changes in America, those associated with race, gender, and class, and the sacralization of music appreciation that we inherited from the first half of the 20th century. Struggles between tradition and innovation, between homogeneity and diversity, between serious and popular, between Western and other, just to name a few. And the traditional textbook repertoire and organization, that is classical music organized chronologically, carries with it ethical implications that, if left unaddressed, threaten to continue some of the same cultural work and values they did over 60 years ago. For the remainder of my time, I will provide a few examples of how textbooks have implicitly and explicitly engaged in these issues in the past 60 years, and then I'll offer some general observations and challenges to our field. Since the 1950s, it's not uncommon for music appreciation textbooks to claim to be about music, and yet focus exclusively on the canon from the Western European art tradition. In the 1950s, classical music was still found in many primary and secondary school curricula, and based on their own experiences, many students were also of the assumption that a course in music was a course in classical music. Not so today. In my own experience, when asked what they expect out of a course in music appreciation, the several thousand students I've taught in past years only rarely mention the classical repertoire. To place classical music in a place of privilege in a music appreciation textbook requires explanation in 2015. Not doing so simply means we, as advocates, are communicating with one another through our textbooks and not communicating to our students. It says more about us than it does about the larger American culture of which we and our students are a part. Many authors do attempt to explain the scope of their book's repertoire, and reading these explanations through the lens of history is truly fascinating. Like their early 20th century counterpoints, Authors over the past 20 years have continued to voice concerns about the ubiquity of music in daily life and the falling position of classical music. Advocates perpetuate the canon for fear that if they don't, classical music will not be heard by today's society. They continue to write classical music as more worthy of study because it's more complicated, needs explanation, and rewards concentrated study, unlike popular music. We're now living in a world where popular music has a long history, and we recognize its classics and realize that the popular tradition has much to offer in the way of complicated and rewarding repertoire. Yet the tradition of teaching course objectives through a classical canon and chronological survey continues. And as it does, we and our students continue to feel the tensions of the history of our discipline butting up against cultural discourse today. A classical canon that for generations focused exclusively on white European male composers not only speaks to aesthetic privilege, but to racial, gender, and class privilege as well. When authors sought to include more diverse repertoires in the 1970s, they tacked those chapters onto the ends of their books and even asked other authors to write those chapters. In these early attempts, authors of additional chapters created tension with the primary text as they introduced issues of performance context, culture, race, and class, issues that rarely appeared in preceding chapters. These tensions occurred within the text, but without it as well. What students were reading about music didn't always speak to their own experiences of music in the world around them. The distance between ways of experiencing music within a textbook and in the larger world of American culture grew further and further apart. But these tensions also occurred between the authors themselves as well as the academic fields they represented. The additional narratives provided by ethnomusicologists complicated and even ran contrary to the primary narrative provided by historical musicologists. Since the 1970s, authors have struggled with diversity, race, gender, class, and other cultural issues, and have arrived at a variety of solutions. Some forego any diversity because one runs the risk of giving only a token nod to these repertoires, and these authors would rather not inflate the content of a textbook for the sake of including a bit of general information on other repertoires. Other authors begin to include more and more music alongside the classical canon, and in doing so run the risk of including more than is possible to teach in one semester. By insisting to retain a classical canon and a historical narrative, authors using a traditional textbook format limit their ability to achieve their own creative and engaging pedagogical goals. They unintentionally rely on a history of exclusion based on race, gender, and class, and readers who are not privy to, quote, the way it's always been done, unquote, struggle to recognize their intellectual understanding of music from a textbook with their experience of music in the world around them. Students drop into our world, our understanding of music for one semester, and they often find it to be a foreign country with its own language and culture. Is it necessary to complicate things even more by using outmoded ways of thinking and continuing narratives that these same authors steer clear from in their own scholarship? In the roughly 100 years since the beginning of music appreciation in the United States, the field continues to butt against the lingering effects of its role in the cultural discourse at the beginning of the 20th century. Even though most textbooks include diverse repertoires, authors struggle to justify the classical repertoire and include popular and non-Western musics. Even those who don't explicitly struggle with cultural issues run the risk of implicitly complying with the constructions of race, gender, and social class that music appreciation advocates helped create in the field's infancy. In my opinion, the meta-dialogue about music appreciation textbooks found between music appreciation textbooks reveals great potential for transformational change. Those of us who seek novel approaches typically find common ground with current authors in the area of course objectives, most especially teaching critical thinking and listening skills. Where we disagree is on how to do that. Adherents of chronological organization have, and continue to, struggle with what this traditional model communicates to general students about classical music. It is in this very struggle that I see a vibrant field at the point of great potential capable of responding to the current larger cultural discourse in America. And this is where we come full circle. We begin as a cultural movement, and we should return to those roots. we are missing a golden opportunity to change the world around us instead of reacting to the world and slightly tweaking roughly the same story we've been telling for a century. We can be part of a cultural movement for our own time, one that looks around us and joins in current cultural discourses in meaningful and challenging ways. And I'd like to see us tackle it head on.
Good morning. My first encounter with the music appreciation course was in the summer of 1982 when, a few weeks before starting my master's program at Temple University in Philadelphia, I received a package in the mail that contained a letter informing me that I had been given a full assistantship and that I would be teaching a music appreciation course. The package also contained a copy of Roger Camian's book, Music and Appreciation. That was the total extent of the preparation and coaching I received before stepping in front of my first class. Oh, those poor students. If the epidemic known as the death of the classical music audience had a patient zero, it wouldn't surprise me that he or she came from that class. Not so many years later, I became Roger Camian's editor, and together we published several editions of his book together at McGraw-Hill, where I also worked with David Willoughby, Gene Ferris, Kathy Charlton, David Stewart, and the team behind On Music. Now at W.W. Norton, I work with Chris Forney, Andrew Dell'Antonio, Tom Kelly, and other authors waiting in the wings. In the 20-plus years of my editorial career working in music appreciation, I have seen technology grow and evolve. New books have arrived, and others have been left behind. I've published for a very bottom-line driven company, and now for a company driven by ideas. I've lost hair, and I've gained weight. And I've learned what's involved in publishing a successful music appreciation textbook. Unfortunately, I've also learned what's involved in publishing an unsuccessful music appreciation textbook. Why do some efforts succeed and some fail? What do we define as success and failure? How can new and innovative approaches to the course get published? These are the questions I hope to address in the next few minutes. While no single thing determines which books thrive and which do not, there is one single factor that matters more than any other, and that is market acceptance. If many instructors adopt a book, it succeeds. Any suggestion that publishers and authors determine the choices available, that they somehow act as gatekeepers, is wrong-headed. We want to publish materials that make money, reward the authors, earn back the investment, and turn a profit, or whatever word you want to use for the money that's left over after costs, royalties, and operating expenses are paid. Whether independent and employee-owned like W.W. Norton, part of a big corporation like McGraw-Hill, or a not-for-profit company like Oxford, we want to do things that justify the investment of time, energy, and money. So when you look around and realize that most music appreciation books today share some basic characteristics, an introduction to the elements and a repertoire drawn primarily from the Western classical tradition presented in chronological sequence, it's because that is what most adopters and committees and instructors choose to adopt. There have always been, and continue to be, alternatives to that approach, but none has captured more than a thin slice of the market. The so-called traditional books account for more than 90% of the books currently in use. Moreover, the 3 books that were at the top of the market in 1993 when I started as an editor are still at the top of the market today. What is the market, and how do we define success or failure in it? My best estimate is that music appreciation courses in higher education enroll around 350,000 students a year. It is by far the largest course in music, and not coincidentally, the most competitive in terms of publishers engaged and books and programs available. How much of that market must a book capture to succeed? Looking back over the book launches in the last 20 years or so, I can't think of a book that has sold fewer than 7,000 or 8,000 copies in its first year that survived to a second edition. The reason? These are expensive programs to publish. The average photo permission cost for a music appreciation book is perhaps $75,000. Music licensing, whether for CD, download, or streaming, is expensive. A lot is invested in the technology behind active listening guides, online quizzes, PowerPoint slides, and videos. Licensing a 90-second clip from Vertigo costs $8,000 for a one-time use, and so forth. Of course, for each of these elements we take away, the costs go down. But so, at least in my experience, does the appeal of the book to potential instructors. And that brings me to the last question and the crux of the matter. How can new and innovative approaches be published in this environment? Two things have to happen. First, you, that is, the people who teach the course and make adoption decisions, have to be both vocal and clear about what you want. When a music appreciation survey comes your way, take it. If I or one of my competitors ask you to review a proposal, do it. And if you don't say, this is a good book, and if you do the review, don't say, this is a good book that should be published, if you don't have any intent to actually try to use it. You can even be proactive. If you see me at a conference or want to send me an email that says, this is what will engage my students today, I'm all ears. Second, when something new and intriguing comes along, try it. Yes, you might have to change your syllabus. Yes, it might not work. Maybe the book doesn't come with PowerPoints. But if the approach speaks to you, if the music choices appeal to you, try it. I'll close with one last point. I've attended a lot of sessions like this in over 22 years as an editor. While I believe that various alternative approaches to the course have real potential, I believe just as strongly that the traditional way of teaching the course has a lot of merit. It's always easy to forget that your students don't know what you do. They don't have the same background, they don't have the same experiences. Trends and issues come and go, but there is still a lot of great music that, along with its context and history, represents a great undiscovered country to the average college student. Tradition and innovation are not opposites, there's room for both. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. My paper is titled Selling the New Approach, Challenges and Successes. I guess I'm the technological dinosaur here.